Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jude Blanchette of Csis. I'm really delighted to be hosting this discussion of Chunhan Wang's fantastic recent book, The Party of One, The Rise of Xi Jinping and China Power's Superpower Future, which was published this May. Chunhan, who I'm sure most viewers already know, is a China reporter at the Wall Street Journal who has been covering Chinese politics, policy, foreign policy for a long time, and is certainly one of the best analysts of contemporary China and Xi Jinping. But we're also delighted to have two of the additional best observers of Chinese politics and decision-making. We've got Neil Thomas, who's a fellow for Chinese politics at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis, and Sheena Greitens, who's a visiting associate professor of research in Indo-Pacific security at the U.S. Army War College. We're going to get right into it, but just a very brief format for today. I'll start out by asking Chunhan a few questions about the book. And then we'll dive right into a discussion with the entire group, both of some of the conclusions that Chunhan has reached in the book and why those matter, but we also want to get into some of the burning questions that I think are on the minds of many right now as we watch this rapidly evolving or devolving, I guess, political system in China. Questions about the death of former Premier Li Keqiang and what that means for Xi Jinping. Is this something that could open up the gates of dissent? I'll ask the group about how strong or weak they think Xi Jinping's current position in power is, and how would we know? And then we'll also look a bit into the murky future to try to gauge what's next for China's political system and Xi Jinping. So thanks to everyone for joining this. And with that, we'll get right into it. And Chunhan, firstly, huge congratulations on this. I know this was a lot of work. Also came out at perfect timing for those, I think everyone just increasingly confused about what's happening in China's political system. Where is it going? What sort of leader is Xi Jinping? I think we're now well into the third act of Xi's time in power with lots of really critical questions. And your book is, I think, the best place to go to try to begin to wrestle with these. As a first question, I wanted to ask you, just when you were first, putting notes down to begin the work on a proposal for this book, what were the puzzles or challenges or sort of questions you had about Xi, the way his power worked, how his leadership worked, that motivated you to want to spend a few years researching this? What was gnawing at you in those early days?
Mm-hmm. So thanks for having me on the show, and appreciate the kind words you have for the book. In terms of what was, interested me in terms of researching Xi Jinping for this book, I think a lot of it was about how, the mechanics of his power. How do you accumulate it? How do you enforce it? How do you enforce his authority over the party? What does he want to do with this power, and how effective he has been in using this power? And I'm also interested in how this particular system that Xi Jinping has built around himself, this highly concentrated, highly centralized hierarchy, how does that, affect people in the rank and file? I was interested in how, the everyday bureaucrats, local officials, how they survive, how they function in the Xi era, where they are under central leadership that expends far greater energy than before in policing their behavior and sort of enforcing what they see to be exemplary conduct. And I think in the course of this book, I actually, I was fortunate enough to be able to do some of my reporting and research for the book in my day job for the Wall Street Journal. While in terms of this issue I was talking about just now, I was able to write a front page story for the journal where I sort of explored this topic of formalism and bureaucratism, which is one way this, the Xi Jinping era sort of manifests itself in this very perverse way. We had officials trying to cope with the high pressure governance that Xi exerts on them. So they resort to doing very weird things in response to very weird incentives, that's been exerted on them. So, I had a lot of fun anecdotes in that story describing how local officials would perform political red rituals or even commit outright fraud to feign compliance with Xi's very broad and sometimes conflicting demands. So I think I was very interested in trying to tease out, some of these implications of Xi's approach to governance. And obviously the other, the book, if you've read it already, it covers a lot wide span of topics, from diplomacy to history to national unity. But I think initially when I thought about writing this book, I really wanted to come to grips with how does the party function under Xi Jinping?
I'm curious, along the way, as you were working on this, what is a preconceived notion or a prior assumption you had about either the political system or Xi Jinping that was overturned or significantly modified by the time you clicked save on the final draft?
Mm-hmm. Actually, to be honest, there wasn't anything I really changed my mind about or surprised by, because I think the process of researching for this book was sort of this iterative process where I'm sort of building on incremental gains done, both by the journal, me and my colleagues, our research, our reporting, and also the work of other people, and other analysts like yourself and Neil and Sheena. So it's not like there was some eureka moment where you discover something that really changed your mind about what's going on. It's more about incremental knowledge gains that, sort of help you refine your understanding of how Xi operates, how the party operates under him. So I don't think there was anything in particular that really struck me as oh, wow, I never knew this. And therefore I'm, doing a 180 of my understanding of how Xi operates. But I think it's more in a case of we learn a bit more. Okay, we have a better understanding of how he approaches certain issues, how he thinks about certain issues. So I think that was how I, in terms of my thinking on Xi, how it was more like an evolution rather than a sudden or revelation. But I think in terms of what it did reinforce for me, I think this idea that Xi is very adept at playing the political game. He is very good at using the party machinery to advance his interest. And it's also, I think maybe this is a bit less well understood, or maybe some people don't see it the same way as I did, which is I think he's actually quite careful in how he deploys his political capital. Yes, he does break precedent, he does break norms, he does break rules where he deems necessary, but I feel like he's also shown himself to be capable of exercising economy of strength. For example, as I cover in the book and also in my reporting for the journal, is when he sort of tries to consolidate his power and neutralize potential threats, to his personal authority, he doesn't necessarily purge people outright. So he's gone after potential alternate centers of power, like Wang Qishan or Li Yuanchao, or even Li Keqiang, not necessarily by going after the person himself, because that would involve expending huge amounts of political capital, potentially upending, power dynamics in a party beyond the way he would want it to. So he goes after these people by investigating their secretaries or, investigating their former associates, things like that, where, you can achieve the same goal with far less cost and far less disruption to the party. So I think that's one thing I think maybe it deserves a broader audience.
Can I ask, just to unpack that a little bit more, maybe in the general discussion, we can bring Sheena and Neil on in this as well. Is that a personality trait that is biased towards careful expenditure of political capital, or is that indicate relative vulnerability to where if he directly went at political targets, the cost or the risk would be too high?
I think it's probably both. But in terms of the personality side of it, I think a lot of it's learned behavior, insofar as we can tell from his upbringing. During the Mao era, he had, he liked to talk about the fact that his one true education in his life is political education. Yes, he had a chemical engineering degree from Tsinghua. He did go to Bai school and all that, but as we know, his formal education was highly disrupted by the Cultural Revolution. So the one thing he truly learned, his true education, was in politics and how the political game is played in the Communist Party. So I think he understood really well how fickle, how ephemeral one's own political power can be, how fragile it is, how it can come and go very quickly, and sort of the games that you have to play is sort of hiding your true intentions and how you can play people off each other. That all those tactics that he saw growing up under Mao, I think that's what he internalized and has called forth when he's finally taken power himself and, deploy some of those tricks and tactics in the way he governs the party.
If we were comparing 11 years of the Xi administration to 10 years of Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, and then the prior 1989 to 2002, 3, 4, Jiang Zemin, what would you say? Again, totally different historical periods. The 1990s are very different from the 2000s, are very different from the 2010s. So to some extent, these temporal comparisons of Chinese leaders are hard to make because the circumstances are different. But still, if you were expressing or explaining what you think the one or two most significant differences, either in temperament, strategy, policy agenda, risk tolerance, between Xi Jinping and his two immediate predecessors, what would you say?
I think maybe it was a bit technical, but I think he's a far more Leninist person or leader in his approach to politics and governance compared to Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. So you might also describe it as being ideological in the sense that Xi demands compliance with his normative political vision in the face of practical considerations. So that ultimately being read is more important than being expert. Delivering on the macro political vision that he has laid out is more important than finding pragmatic solutions to policy problems. So I think you might even attribute this in some way to each leader's academic upbringing, their training or lack thereof in terms of Xi Jinping. So both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao were both trained as engineers. Right, so Jiang Zemin was an electrical engineer and Hu Jintao was a hydropower engineer. Whereas Xi Jinping, yes, he studied chemical engineering, but it's not really an academic degree. As mentioned in a book that one of his friends at the time described it as a degree in Marxism, when he was studying in Tsinghua. So it's that sort of a difference in upbringing, I think, could be reflected in how they approach problems. So I think Xi Jinping, when his true education is in politics, he takes a very political lens to issues. He approached governance problems, I think, politically. He sees political problems and therefore prescribes political solutions. Whereas someone with a technocratic background might approach the problem differently. He would see, a policy problem and prescribe much more technocratic or, a more pragmatic solution that's driven at solving the problem. Whereas Xi Jinping, I think his background is more given to diagnosing a macro political problem. And therefore, he will prescribe a political solution to these issues. And I think that's in some ways could go quite far in explaining the sort of approach he takes in his governance, where he sort of lays out a broad political vision or political guidelines as to how a problem should be solved. He doesn't necessarily prescribe down to the detail. He may not be very conversant in specific matters of this policy sector, but he would set down the red lines. He would set down the long-term goals, and then it's sort of up to people below him to deliver. And he would interfere every now and then where he sees something that doesn't quite work out the way he wants it to. But he's not in the business of line by line drawing out policy proposals. But he's interested in setting the big picture and expecting people to operate within the boundaries that he sets.
One final question dedicated to you, Chun-Han, then I want to ask Neil and Sheena to come in. But I was actually just, as you were talking, I was thinking about the title, Party of One. And I wanted to ask, how do you think, first of all, explain the title. I think, because I think the second part of this question is, of course, no dictator rules alone. And so I wanted to ask how you think about how and where we should bring in and think about advisors to Xi Jinping. Cai Qi, for example, right now seems to be the guy. Yeah, I feel bad for Ding Xuexiang, who used to have that position, and I think is now sort of sitting in the corner waiting to be asked to dance by Xi Jinping. So we've known that throughout his tenure there have been a group of individuals who maybe they sometimes have pole position, maybe they move back, but they're still in the orbit, right? We think of, we think of Wang Huning comes to mind, right? With a lot of this stuff, as a Ding Xuexiang, Han Zheng, for a vice president seems to be doing more, going to UNGA. We're seeing the office of the premier now go through this kind of odd re-empowerment, maybe, or it's simply a matter of Li Qiang being closely trusted. Wang Qishan, early on in the Xi administration, played a very important role in anti-corruption. So if you were kind of writing a book about Xi Jinping's advisors, who would be in the table of contents for playing key roles? And second is, how important are they to policy, formulation and implementation?
So the first question, the title of the book, actually I think I've told some people this story, but the title Party of One was originally the title of the chapter on succession. As you can see why, like basically he's remade the party around himself and he is like a one-man walking key person risk. It's a corporate term, but this guy represents key person risk on a global scale, being the leader of the world's second largest economy and one of the most consequential nations on earth. So that was originally my idea for the title of the succession chapter. But then my agent suggested to me, the moment he saw my proposal, like, that should be the title of the book. And I was like, yes, actually, that makes a lot of sense because it goes beyond succession, right? It speaks to how he has made himself the center of political and public life in China. Everything has his name on it. All major policies. You couldn't go to any shopping mall now and not see some digital, screen that puts his face on every now and then. Like his slogans with his name are like, especially in Beijing, at least when I was there. You see his face and name in all sorts of places. That's something that, not that it never happened before, but it definitely became very clear, as she grew more powerful into his reign. So I think the title essentially is a very succinct way to describe this change, both the optics of it and also the practical elements of it, which is Xi Jinping has, in essence, put himself at the center of political and public life in China. And 3 words for a book title, I think, is very easy to convey that idea. In terms of advisors, I think there are advisors and there are advisors, right? They are, like you mentioned, Cai Qi. I was discussing this with someone recently that, Cai Qi is really important. Obviously, he is the director of the General Office of the Central Committee. It's a highly important job. He's the nerve center of the party. But at the same time, I don't think he holds that role and as seen as a type of aide that, say, Ding Xuexiang was and Li Zhanshu was. These 2 people being the previous holders of that office. Li Zhanshu was a far more like a peer to Xi Jinping. They were county chiefs together in counties that were practically side by side back in the 80s, right? And Ding Xuexiang, I think, have worked more closely in some degrees with Xi Jinping, especially when they were in Shanghai, and then that relationship carried on through in the early years of Xi Jinping's rule as general secretary. But I think Cai Qi, well, first of all, the fact that he's a standing committee member, I have a friend who made the joke that essentially Xi Jinping has grown so much in his sense of imperial self-importance that only a standing committee member is fit to run the general office, of today. So like in some ways, I think it reflects that. But at the same time, the relationship between him and Xi Jinping, I don't think it's the same as Li Zhanshu, the one that Li Zhanshu had, for example. Cai Qi is my understanding. I mean, this is sort of based on a bit of like gossip, the grapevine, which it's hard to really verify. But the idea is that he seems to be more of like a implementer. Like he's the aide, he is the guy who is told to do certain things and he tries to get it done, rather than someone who actually brings ideas to the leader. Whereas I think that role is perhaps more fulfilled by someone like Wang Huning or even someone like Li Qiang. So our understanding of Li Qiang's relationship with Xi Jinping is, is a very interesting one. The secretary or the Mishu, with the officials that he serves, like that relationship is very symbiotic. It's sort of a very implicit trust that's built up over years of working together. The Mishu is very good at divining the boss's will and trying to sort of translate it into actionable directives. Like that relationship, I think you're far more able to articulate what the leader wants. You're able to guess what he wants, and also you have a certain way of communicating with a leader that you wouldn't have if you're just someone who's seen as like more of like a executor and enforcer. So I think within the standing committee, within the Politburo, this is hard to figure out precisely because of how, the nature of black box politics. It's very hard to know the individual dynamics of people's relationships. But insofar as we can discern them, I think some of it is clear to us that the relationship that Xi Jinping has with each individual Politburo member or standing committee member is different. It has changed over time, or like when people have, different people occupy the same office, we can see that I think the relationship between them is different, which means he may have a different perspective of how this particular office should function. But I think that in terms of who should be in that contents page of advisors that matter, I think it's not a secret. I think a lot of them we've already talked about. A lot of people have talked about them before. So you're talking about people like Wang Puning, you're talking about people like Li Qiang, maybe potentially someone like Chen Min-er, but I'm not sure. His star seems to have faded since people talked him up when he was Chongqing Party secretary. But as you say, these things come and go. We're never really sure how these interpersonal relationships might evolve. But I think you shouldn't have to look too far beyond the existing Politburo to have a sense. And also, actually, the Central Policy Research Office. I think Wang Puning's successor there, I think, is also someone to watch. He has been quite a vocal, person in terms of articulating what the leader wants. So I think these are the key characters we have to look for.
Sheena, Neil, I'd like to bring you in. So I guess Sheena first for you, then Neil. Just first of all, feel free to ask Chunhan any questions that I didn't ask or failed to ask or didn't ask clearly enough or concisely enough. Second, just general impressions on the book or anything Chunhan has just said on any of the questions I asked. Sheena, over to you.
Yeah, well, first, congratulations, Chunhan. This is a terrific book. I really enjoyed reading it, even having, read your reporting for a long time. There was a lot that you stitched together here and contextualize and sort of present that's really an interesting portrait of Xi Jinping and of China under Xi Jinping. So many congrats on that. I have about 4 things that jumped out at me when I was reading the book, the last of which is a question that follows up on some of what Jude has already said. First, just starting with the book title, right? I think your book really draws out, at least in the world that I come from, which is academic political science, we tend to think of authoritarian regimes as either party-led or personalist, or we have for a long time. And I think what you do is show us what the fusion of those two looks like. Right, when you have a very sort of a strong personal leader atop a party system who really tries to take over, remake the party for his personal vision of governance, and that's something that I think the book draws out in a really interesting way, and it's something that I think at least in the academic field that I sit in is a little bit challenging to our usual the sort of category boxes we like to separate things into. But second, then, and you used this phrase once already this morning, the challenge that creates for succession in China's political system is immense. And you use this phrase this morning, and it's in, I think, maybe one of the early chapters of the book, key person risk, right? That if Xi Jinping really is looking out for the longevity of party rule, he's actually created a significant point of failure risk here for the party. And I just thought that was a fascinating point that you made in a way that I haven't heard a lot of other people make. And so I don't know if we want to double back and talk about succession a little bit more, but the part about the rise of Xi Jinping and then the implications of what the next transfer to the next leader might look like, I thought were really well done. The third point that I thought that you drew out really in a really interesting way that I just was really struck by, even though this is an area that I follow pretty closely, was a discussion about Xi Jinping's use of law, right? And I remember reading Han Fei in grad school when I was writing my dissertation, which was more about Taiwan than mainland China, but the sort of legalist framework that he uses and just the pace with which you call him the codifier in chief, which I thought was a really nice phrase, because he has passed an immense number of national security laws, which is the area I follow, but you do a really nice job of pointing out that he's also the NPC under Xi Jinping has just passed a lot more laws in general, right? And so this legalization and the use of law as a tool of party governance, I thought was really was a really helpful part of the book. And then the fourth one, which is really the question I wanted to throw out, because I do think it gets to this puzzle of how strong is Xi Jinping really, right? How And what does it mean to be strong in a system like the one he's created? There are multiple threats that any leader has to contend with in different political systems. And as the institutional design of the system changes, so does the risk to the person at the top. But I was really interested, you go through in the book kind of the fact that Xi Jinping purged a significant number of leaders in the coercive apparatus in the military. He cut the PLA significantly. I think only maybe Mao and Deng Xiaoping have reduced the size of the military as much as Xi Jinping did. And these are things that typically could be seen as, and the anti-corruption purges were kind of maybe a little bit of a pushback on the PLA's traditional autonomy. Not that he's taken away that autonomy. I'm definitely not saying that, right? The PLA retains some significant organizational autonomy. But Xi Jinping has done some things that traditionally in a lot of other non-democratic political systems would maybe raise the risk of the military acting against him, aligning with another leader or just doing something to challenge him. And so I actually think, but on the other hand, Leninist systems, you talked about Xi Jinping as sort of the ultimate Leninist, right? Leninist systems tend to have very low rates of military coups or attempted military takeover. And so I wanted to ask you kind of how you put all these pieces together, because when I look at Xi Jinping's China, one of the biggest puzzles for me that bears directly on this question of, I think, of how strong or weak he is, and also has lots of implications for things like a Taiwan scenario, are what is his relationship with the military? How comfortable with his level of command, the quality of the information he gets from the military, and how do we think that relationship functions, and what is his perception of it? What's the military's perception of it? You bring a lot of really interesting details out in the book, but I confess I remain puzzled by what this relationship is, and I think it's hugely consequential for Chinese politics, traditionally has been in Chinese history, which you point out. So that's my sort of like question I wanted to toss back, which is, what do you make of his evolving relationship with the military, and how that matters inside the political system you describe? So I'll stop there, but those are things that jumped out at me, and one potential question for you. And then Jude, I'm happy to follow up, but I want to stop there.
Great. Chunhan, do you want to offer some thoughts on that question?
Sure. I mean, I like to think about Xi Jinping's power in two terms. Like, one is like, where his relative standing to other people in the party, like to his peers, his fellow leaders. And I think on that front, he's unquestionably powerful. There's no clear rival. There's no clear alternate power center. There's no doubt that he is numero uno. The other terms which we can look at power is, what can he get done? And I think the record there is far more mixed. You don't have to look too far in terms of what he has failed to deliver. The example I use in the book, for example, is retirement age. I was at the very press conference in 2015 where the labor minister at the time promised to raise the retirement age. Or at least by 2017, there will be a roadmap. They will roll out some plan that explains which options they've chosen and the timeline for implementing. And we're now into almost the end of 2023, and we've seen nothing on any meaningful progress on that front. So I think in terms of, you have all this power, but your ability to deploy it doesn't necessarily translate, right? You are still constrained by practicalities of the bureaucracy, the difficulties, the challenges you're trying to take on. So I think it is useful to try to use this framework to understand when we say how powerful Xi Jinping is. We want to be able to measure in some way. So if you measure in terms of, is he in charge? Is there anyone who can challenge his power in the party? I think is no. So in that sense, very powerful. But in terms of ability to implement that authority and use it in a meaningful way, maybe not so much. Moving on to the military piece of it, I think we talked about the purges, right? So I think what Xi Jinping clearly has done quite well is that, yes, you destroy a lot of people's careers, you upset a lot of vested interests in the military, but at the same time, I think you have to empower a certain other faction in the military. There are always winners and losers in purges. So clearly has identified the winners of the purges and allied with them in a way that it has only consolidated its own position and its own influence over the military. So I think the key beneficiaries are people who actually believe in having a modernized, capable fighting force, the people who actually are, professional soldiers and take pride in having command of a military that can go toe-to-toe with the West, go up against America, against European powers, and be able to, deploy advanced weaponry, engage in combined arms operations and things like that. People who actually want to see, a PLA worthy of the name. And I think Xi Jinping has, done a good job in sort of making sure these people are empowered. Obviously, recent events suggest that there are still some big problems in the military that he has yet to resolve fully. But I think in terms of understanding how he has asserted his control over the military, I think he's basically identified who he wants to be rid of and found the right people to team up with and who accept his authority. And he has in turn empowered these people to rise up in the system and take senior positions in the PLA.
Neil, let me bring you in. Same set of questions to Sheena, but just general thoughts and impression on the books. Any thoughts on comments made where you'd like to add or fill in gaps or challenge any of the comments made? And then if you had any questions for Chunhan emerging from the book, we'd welcome you raise those as well.
Thanks, Jude. Yeah, I'll just join the chorus of praise for Chunhan's book. I think it's
Thank you.
The best overview of Chinese politics in the Xi era, and anyone who hasn't read it should go out and grab a copy and use it to fill people's stockings at Christmas or whatever you celebrate coming up. So I think it's a great book. Thank you for writing it, Chunhan. In terms of two highlights for me, in terms of the book's contents, I mean, it's all good, but I think it's the past and the future of Xi's role in Chinese politics, I think done especially well, like telling that story of Xi's rise to power. I think, and you obviously, draw together different sources, but I think it's the best kind of condensation of that journey from, Xi's childhood to Xi being, on the throne of Chinese politics, and just kind of highlighting the role of, Xi's skill as a political operator and how he would, cultivate senior leaders at the time, like the importance of Jiang Zemin and especially Jia Qinglin in Xi's rise, and how he played the game. And I mean, you use a quote from Robert Caro, the biographer of LBJ here in the US, that when you're rising through the ranks, you conceal, but when you have power, that reveals. And I think that that's kind of really useful in thinking about how people got Xi Jinping so wrong, right? And he was playing a game, right? He wasn't putting his cards on the table. He wasn't, really aligning himself strongly with either particular camps. He was obviously cultivating Jiang, but he wasn't, ever seen as Jiang's top lieutenant or anything like that at the time. And I think that holds some lessons for us in thinking about, what's next in Chinese politics. Like it's may well be the case that we've got, I think it is the case, we have no idea who is, next and who might be coming. But in terms of even how we think about that conversation, we do really have to remember how little we know, especially about these interpersonal relationships between the top leaders. We kind of know that Li Chang's kind of taking a lead role in the economy. Cai Qi's actually doing a lot of things behind the scenes. But in terms of who others would rally behind, or who might have a ruthless political skill set that they haven't shown to us yet, we know very little about those things. I think that's kind of leads me to the other highlight, which is the discussion of succession. And obviously Jude and Richard Richard McGregor wrote a great paper about that as well. So these are kind of the two best things written about this question. And I think that, Chunhan arrives at a conclusion that maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Chunhan, but my impression is that you think it maybe is more likely than not that Xi will at some point, name a successor and try and, put his political capital behind a succession plan. That's obviously not happening in the near future in your telling, but I think that is, it's a source of uncertainty, but also in potential, debate and disagreement. Like I potentially think that Xi is a little bit, all the reasons why he hasn't chosen a successor so far, the fact that you create potentially like a rival, you have a lame duck situation where your power might start to drain away, you don't have necessarily guarantees about how that successor is going to deal with you and your family. are kind of ingredients for indecision in politics. And we may kind of get a situation where it's not necessarily a strong succession, it's more like a kind of Mao and, Hua Guofeng type situation where she kind of sees the writing on the wall for himself a bit too late, and there's only a very weak successor without as much planning. But I think, I don't know, like that's, I think that you make a pretty good case that, made me certainly think about, it was more likely than I'd previously thought that she could get behind that sort of a plan. So that's, maybe something we can talk about later. In terms of two kind of questions that kind of the book made me think of, I mean, there's a lot in a very good way, right? In terms of stimulating discussion and debate about Chinese politics. I think for me, there's two things I'd be really curious to get your further thoughts on firstly, I think the role of ideology. I mean, that's something that we talk about a lot with Xi. It's, kind of a theme that goes across a lot of chapters in the book. And, there's these statistics like, local government officials saying they're spending 30 to 40% of their time, or SOE employees too, on ideological training. And on one sense, it's, it seems ridiculous and it's, a waste of time. But I guess I wonder if you could share some more thoughts on like, why do you think Xi is doing this? And is there a case that it is beneficial for policymaking and implementation in the party, in kind of the way that, a multinational firm might kind of invest in this whole, corporate values type campaign that they think will, help them to, get more work out of their employees. And curious on your thoughts on that. And then secondly, we talk a lot about the mistakes that she's made, or in our view, what are mistakes that she has made. And I think it's clear he's made quite a few in terms of, China's foreign policy and China's economy. But I'm curious as to if Xi Jinping was made to go through one of his own performance evaluations, kind of account for his performance to the party, what are kind of the three biggest successes you think he would discuss? And are those actually successes? So those are just a couple of things that I would love to hear, more from you on, that hopefully are interesting to everyone watching.
But, before you get to that, Sheena, I know I had missed a ping from you that you wanted to come in on the back of a previous topic. So maybe before we go into ideology and self-assessments, let me just turn it over to you, Sheena, for a second to close off that thread.
Yeah, sure. So first, I forgot to say this earlier, but everything I'm saying today are my individual views, not the views of the U.S. Army, the Army War College, Department of Defense. Forgot, I got to get that out of the way. With that done, thank you. So my only point was just as a follow-up to some of what Chunhan was saying, and Jude, the question you raised, right? How powerful Xi Jinping is not the same as asking how secure his hold on power is. And I think, right, if we take Xi Jinping at his word, he actually in some ways sees China's power and China's security as inversely correlated, right? The more powerful China gets, the bigger the risks and the dangers are. It's this very dialectical thinking about opportunity and power and risk. And so I just wanted to point out that, if we're having a conversation about how powerful he is, and we assume that translates into a perception on his part of security, we may have trouble understanding some of his ongoing behavior. And to me, I think it's really, really important when trying to explain Xi Jinping to de-link those two and remember that they might be positively correlated, but they might actually be inversely correlated. And it seems context dependent. So Chunhan, I'd welcome you to push back on that, or Jude or Neil. But I wanted to throw that out there because I think some of Xi Jinping's statements about China's, the relationship between power and security for China, are fascinating, counterintuitive, but fairly plain in the way he stated them. And if you apply that to, and maybe we shouldn't, right? Maybe we shouldn't personalize this to Xi Jinping's hold on power, but I think it at least opens up a question that we should not assume or take for granted. So that was my only thought, but I think it does bear on and one of the framing questions of the book and of this discussion. So I wanted to put that out there. Thanks, Jude, for your patience and letting me loop back and close that circle.
Because it's a great point. She has said on several occasions, forget the exact wording, but something to the effect of the closer we get to rejuvenation, the harder it's going to become. I think some of that is preparing the system, but I think it's also a diagnosis. I've always said something to the effect of, Xi Jinping is in power, but he's not necessarily in control. Just to distinguish Chun Han's comment of, formal accumulation of political power, but then your ability to implement a policy agenda is a slightly different thing. But maybe we could just go, I think it's a really important framework comment from Sheena and Neil and Chun Han. Let me get your assessment of it as well, because it does seem a structural feature of dictatorship. And actually, I was just watching on Netflix as they try to fill the endless content machine with new documentaries. There's one on John Gotti. And the further up the ranks you move of the mafia, you're more powerful, but I think you feel more vulnerable, right? Because folks are gunning for you. I would imagine it's just a feature of autocratic systems, but Sheena, you do this more formally than I do, that the more powerful you become, you don't feel more secure in that. In fact, I think you're aware of how many potential rivals and enemies you've either created or are right behind you. I think there's the retirement question of, it's hard once you've climbed over enough bodies to get to a position in power. What's the retirement plan you have where you feel like you have any security? And once you leave the throne, then you're a little bit at the whims and wills of whoever assumes it. So, Chun-Han, let's go with you, and then Neil. How do you think at a framework level about that sort of dichotomy between power and security? Do you see it as Sheena has laid it out, or also as Xi Jinping has laid it out, of the closer, the more we stick our head up and our strength and our power becomes known, the more the United States, and its allies is going to be gunning for us?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I remember this conversation that, Drew, we had many years ago back in Beijing, when we were both still there, was that maybe we should start thinking in terms of analyzing Xi Jinping in comparison with Stalin. There's no doubt Stalin was the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, but he was also, probably the most paranoid man in the Soviet Union. He saw enemies everywhere. The fact that you're more powerful, you have more to lose, you perceive more enemies, you have made more enemies. There's just so much more at stake, given where your higher standing within the system. I think the same you apply at the national level. The more interest that China has, the more vulnerabilities you have, the more things you have to defend, the more, it's sort of the burden of knowing more. And in some ways as well, the burden of knowledge, you realize where you're ignorant. So the more powerful you have to realize where you're weak. So I think that's this sort of oxymoronic, sort of self-fulfilling thing where the more powerful you are, in some ways you feel where you're more keenly aware of where you're vulnerable. So I think this applies both at the personal level and both at the state level. So I don't think it's contradictory. I think Sheena makes a very good point about this, and it's definitely something we should think about, when we try to understand why, for a country that professes to be, almost on the cusp of success in rejuvenation, why does it still see so many problems? I think it's because, like you said, it's because it's almost there. Therefore, the stakes are higher, the risk is greater, and the cost of failure is even more, dramatic. So yeah, I'm not sure if Neil has anything to add on this point.
Yeah, I guess just quickly, I think, she is smart to realize that, right? Yes, obviously things that he has done have contributed to this US-China dynamic, but there's a case to make that there'd be more friction between the two countries, even if, Li Keqiang had been general secretary for the last 10 years. And so, doing things like reorienting China's foreign policy towards the global South, trying to build up domestic bases for innovation and high technology, they're big gambles, but if they end up working, she's going to seem like one of the smartest statesmen in the world. It's a different question as to how likely they are to work, but in terms of diagnosing the issues that China is currently facing, there's other ways he could go about doing it, but it's not irrational to kind of be pursuing the policies he is. Then on a personal level, in elite politics, yes, Stalin was very paranoid, but he did, he ruled the Soviet Union for his entire, the rest of his life. And I think that the similar kind of calculation applies to Xi from the, brutal perspective of just, commanding elite politics. Like, it's not a weakness to be identifying these problems. It's actually a strength. It's it's vigilance. In some ways, just as much as it is insecurity, because that's just the game you're in. If you're a kind of authoritarian leader, you're not winning elections, you're trying to keep your hold on a few instruments of state power, and that's what matters.
We've only got about 14 minutes left, so I had sent through some questions. I might cut a good number of those because I think realistically we've got time for maybe 2 questions. So let me start with one. And Sheena, let me start with you. I think certainly since COVID and the zero COVID policy and the sudden dramatic turnaround of it, but also as we've seen external behavior from China, sort of wolf warriorism that in many ways works against China's own interests, or the passing of the national security law, while Taiwan, in Hong Kong, while Taiwan was going through an election, which resulted in, the polls shifting in favor of Tsai Ing-wen. You could go down the list where I think there has been a diagnosis that one of the reasons we're seeing poor outcomes of the Chinese system or the Xi administration is this information challenge. You hear this in various versions. This comes up in a lot of discussions of, concerns about maybe an invasion of Taiwan, where even if we think he's rational, as we've seen in the case of Vladimir Putin, making a risky invasion of Ukraine, are these autocrats getting the quote right information? So I wanted to ask you a 2-parter, and then I wanted to go to Chunhan and Neil as well. I mean, first of all, you study autocratic systems writ large, so I wanted to ask you just a general framing question of how should we think about information flows and decision making? Is this a bug or a feature of these types of regimes that information flows are highly distorted? And then as a second question, just if you could apply this to your own assessment of the Xi administration and Xi Jinping as well, do you see some of the puzzling outcomes that seem to work against China's own interest as being the product of bad information? And then I think by inverse, if Xi Jinping had quote unquote good information, we would see better outcomes, or do you see something else?
Yeah, I think those are a set of great and really complicated questions that are very difficult to assess in a system that is as opaque at the elite levels as China has become under Xi Jinping. So let me just caveat everything I'm about to say with the appropriate dose of intellectual humility here. In general, information problems are a feature, not a bug, of non-democratic political systems. Leaders tend to set up systems where they hire people who don't like to give them bad news, either because they hire them based on loyalty or because they punish people who do bring them bad news. Saddam Hussein was famous for having, chopped up, I think it was the health minister, and delivered him back to his family in a box, right? Not surprisingly, no one wanted to tell him the truth about the performance or ability to perform of his own military after that. That's not so much. So I think there are some features of that we might be seeing in China, but authoritarian political systems vary in how much they have information problems and where the information problems come from, right? In China, it's been a pretty long-standing feature of Chinese politics that the center sometimes has trouble monitoring and enforcing local officials. And this is something that I think comes out in Party of One in really interesting ways. The attempt of central officials to strengthen their control over the lower levels of bureaucracy is a really interesting thread that goes through it and shows up in a number of places in the book. And I think that discussion's fascinating. So that's typically the sort of the traditional information problem that we see in China's political system. Xi Jinping and the party are clearly aware of this, right? This is not like they've never heard that they have a problem getting information from this massive system that they sit at the top of, right? And one of the things Xi Jinping did in 2015 fairly early on when he was trying to figure out how to get control over Chinese society and the party state system, was to talk about, there's a state council directive that uses this phrase, information-based, multidimensional information-based system of prevention and control, part of which is the surveillance state. But even around, 3-4 years later, I think it was Li Keqiang talked about how the party still had these problems of information islands, that information being collected in one system or one locality wasn't getting integrated with the rest of the information the party had, which made it very hard to use all of the information that they were collecting to actually govern, right? And so that's a separate information problem. Somebody in the system might have the information. It's getting it to the person who actually needs it in a form they can use with all the other information that needs to be weighted in making a policy decision. Right. And so I think that just by nature of the Chinese political system, there are structural informational problems. People like Jeremy Wallace, Jennifer Pan have done some really interesting, research on information flows within the Chinese political system. But I think it's actually hard to tell how much of what we're seeing in some of these decisions is a feature of flawed information versus other features of the Chinese political system. So I'll keep this short, but just take the defense minister as an example, right? The defense minister who was recently removed. There's sort of two stories, I think, about what plausibly could have happened there. And I'm just wildly speculating here because I don't think we know, and maybe we'll find out at some point. And maybe Chunhan or his colleagues can tell us more at some point. So the decision to appoint Li reportedly came from Xi Jinping, which suggests that either he didn't have all the information about the potential corruption that we think then led to Li's removal, or he had the information, wanted to appoint Li. And remember, that was actually potentially a costly decision by Xi Jinping because Li was sanctioned by the United States government. And so that was going to present some problem for the defense relationship with the United States, which is not exactly going swimmingly and smoothly these days. So, either he didn't have the information, which suggests the informational problem, Jude, that you raised, or I think the other hypothesis is that he had it, didn't think it mattered all that much, or thought that he could manage it, then realized that there was some cost that maybe we're not even seeing that led him to reverse course. And that's more an issue of the power that Chunhan is talking about, the power to make these very senior personnel decisions and then reverse them very quickly using the party as the lever or the mechanism of power. One is an informational story. One is a story about concentration of power, that kind of key person risk, which isn't just a succession issue. It's also about the key person risk that comes with one person not having checks and balances on the quality of their decision making. And frankly, no person makes perfect decisions, right? That is typically, in a democracy that's like the United States, that's part of why there's this checks and balances idea between the different branches of government. Other democracies do it differently, but that idea that you need to limit the flawed decision making of one individual is sort of hard baked into certain political systems. It's not in a personalist one. And so I think it's hard to tell what we're seeing, as an informational problem versus a problem of personalization. They're related, but they're not quite the same. And that does affect potentially things like Taiwan and how much confidence Xi Jinping has in the assessments he's getting from his military. How he'll react if he doesn't trust an assessment is probably a longer conversation. But I think, again, we need to think carefully about what the possibilities are if that is in fact the case. And we see the same kind of thing in control over the uniformed military, which we may or may not see. So I don't know if that answers your question, Jude, but I feel like I've talked too long already, so I'll stop there.
No, that was great. Thank you. Chunhan and Neil, just can I get your quick reactions, reflections on the information question? And I think we'll have time for one quick round robin of final thoughts. So Chunhan, let me go to you first. How do you think about the information question?
I think Xi Jinping is very aware of this issue. I mean, I think it was last year or 2 years ago where he talked about this issue, where I basically appealed to officials, like, go out and make friends in the grassroots so you can have a perception of like reality on the ground. You better improve your understanding of what's happening. on the front lines in the coalface. It's a bit rich coming from him, perhaps, but like the fact that he made this a very public appeal, I think he understands the basic nature of the problem, and I'm sure he understands that that also applies to himself. This applies, I mean, I've heard anecdotes, not just him, but other officials have done this as well, like for example, Wang Qishan, where you would also use informal channels. You get your old buddies, your old war comrades, back in the day where you had, like, for example, Wang Qishan used to call upon people he knew when he was more, at the Rural Affairs Office back in the 80s, like get those people to help him run some private, like under the fly, sort of inspections or like, sort of fact-finding missions, and then report back to him. So he has a better sense of what's actually happening on the ground. My understanding that Xi Jinping also talks to people, whether it's like family members or, he in the past, not so sure whether he does as much of it now, was like he actually would talk to fellow princelings, I think, to just at least get a sense of different reporting channels. Apart from the formal party reporting channels, he has other sources of information. Obviously, the quality of that is also questionable, even if we don't really know. And how he applies that, what he does with that information, we also don't really know. But I think he has demonstrated awareness of the problem. I'm just not sure we know enough, we have enough facts on our hands to have a good assessment of whether he has come up with a reasonable solution.
Neil?
Yeah, I'll just add super quickly another thing that is in Chunhan's book and has been discussed elsewhere as well, is the introduction of these kind of public mailboxes on official websites. So I think Chunhan discusses the one on the CCDI website after Wang Qishan kind of took over in the early Xi era, and this allows anyone, as long as you don't put in stuff that's too critical of Xi or people who are affiliated with him, basically to report on local officials who are doing things they don't like. And there's, there's actually dozens and dozens of these mailboxes on different websites. It's kind of like the online version of petitioning, or kind of the letters and calls system. So it's kind of another way in which Xi has at least attempted to try and increase the things in his toolkit to address this information problem.
We have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to take a question that I had flagged I was going to ask, but I'm going to modify it slightly. It's going to be slightly harder, but I think everyone on joining it, the three of you we're all sort of some variation of Xi Jinping is firmly in power. Let me ask what is the specific thing or the sort of thing you would see emerge in open source that would begin to change your mind about in a fundamental way on Xi Jinping's grip on power? It doesn't have to be the specific thing, because I know we don't know, but either give me the specific thing you would see or an indicative sort of thing where you would watch that and say, oh, okay, something's changing here. Chunhan, you wrote the book, so unfortunately you have to go first.
Okay.
What would it be?
I would think in the current context, it would be the emergence or re-emergence of discordant voices on key policy matters or political principles in open source material. So whether it's like state media or like party journals, where, this was common in the past. We would tend to see different, very vigorous debates on key issues in these platforms. But I think Xi Jinping has largely quashed it. It's pretty much speaking with one voice now. But the fact that if, we start to see signs of this re-emerging, more vigorous debates on actually very fundamental issues, I think it's a sign that the perceived risk of speaking against the leader has declined, or they are not so fearful anymore, or they think the stakes are so high that the leader is making so many bad mistakes, we have to speak up or risk the whole edifice collapsing. So I think the re-emergence
can I ask you, what would be the issue? Yeah. What would be the specific topic amongst that blanket statement where you would go, oh my gosh?
Oh, that's a bit tough. I guess it would be things like, fundamental.
Like Taiwan?
It could be Taiwan, could be something fundamental like a term limits, something in terms of like political reforms, things that clearly are unequivocally linked to Xi Jinping and he personally changed. And if you reverse that, then I think it's very clear sign.
Okay, Neil.
I agree with Chunhan. That would be a really big thing to watch. Another thing to watch would be personnel. I mean, the Chinese system is really important to have your people controlling the, important levers of power. So, I mean, if we started seeing, people who were affiliated with, more affiliated with, Jiang Zemin or Tuan Pai or just totally non-Xi people getting promoted into important positions. That would be, over, Xi allies. That would be an important signal, and one you'd expect to happen at the next party congress in a major way if there was some major change in the orientation of power in Beijing. Similarly, if you started seeing like a lot more focus in party media on different types of people and less focus on Xi himself, whether that's Xi being replaced by one of his allies like suddenly Li Qiang, or someone else is the real center of attention, but maybe it's someone different, maybe it's someone in the military. That would also, whatever it is, be a signal.
And Neil, you would not interpret that of a sign of compromise and moderation. You would interpret that as a sign of losing grip.
Well, Xi has to compromise more. He's losing some of his grip on power, right?
Okay.
Okay. The degree of what that happened would, kind of land you on whether this is, a slight compromise given, a falling economy, or whether this is like a major change in, who's actually running the show.
Sheena.
A health issue. Given Xi Jinping's age, I think that's something we should be looking for. A health issue that cannot be, sort of concealed or managed privately, has lots of political implications. That's what forced succession planning in North Korea pretty clearly, from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. And I think it would have the same effect here.
If we saw Xi Jinping swimming in the Yangtze River with that. And so can I ask just very quickly on the Li Keqiang death, do you think, given he was 68, looked good as of his last public appearance, do you think that has any knock-on effects? Does that raise uncomfortable questions? What do you think?
It raises questions, but questions that are already there because Xi Jinping is so central to the system, and it's unclear how it would function if anyone else tried to take his place.
Yeah. Well, sorry to have rushed the final few questions, but as someone said before we started recording, the hour will go by fast, and it did, and I only got to about 14% of the questions I had prepared. So first of all, just another huge congratulations to Chun-Han for writing this great book, which is going to persist and last. This is a book that explains the last decade and gives us a good, firm stance to look forward another 10 years with the appropriate caveat that Sheena made about intellectual humility. Nonetheless, I think this is going to be a really lasting book. And then really hearty thanks to comrades Sheena Greitens and Neil Thomas for joining us on a Monday morning.